tonight's session at Osher Lifelong Learning at the University of New Mexico. The course is Making Plans to Live Well Until We Die, Part 1. We do have a Part 2 with 3 other very interesting panelists that will take place 6:30 to 8 after this. Give you a little half-hour break, catch something to eat. So all of this is part of the inaugural Before I Die Albuquerque Festival. And in your bags we have the listing of all of the events coming up. We're on day 3 right now of a 6-day festival of activities to get us thinking about, talking about, and doing something about our 100% mortality rate. And I do want to give a big thank you to Osher Lifelong Learning Institute here at the University of New Mexico for hosting us for both of these sessions, as well as the yoga class we did yesterday, which was From Child Pose to Corpse Pose. That was a lovely session. And to all of our sponsors who are making this festival possible, which includes French Funerals and Cremations, the Neptune Society, Morris Hall Estate Planning Law Firm, Retirement Extender, which helps make the most of your finances in retirement, Express Legal Solutions, and Lasting Legacy, which help provide trust services. And then we've got other friendly support from a number of other folks, Zia Trust, the Old Pine Box, My Final Checklist, and lifeisshort.com, which is Peter Callan, who creates a guide called Prepare to Die, and Other Things Nobody Told You. And in fact, as part of our drawing for the free cremation from the Neptune Society, you will get the opportunity to we'll do a drawing just for tonight to see who gets this guide. So tonight we are talking about making plans to live well until we die. And I have a wonderful, distinguished panel from right to left, no, right to left, yes. Jan Wilson, representing Compassion and Choices. Joan Gibson, who is representing the Conversation Project in New Mexico, as well as she is retired. I'm going to let you describe what you did working at UNM. How was that? Everybody's going to introduce themselves and how they come to this. And at the far left, Dr. Nancy Gwynn. She is the medical director of Presbyterian at Home and developer of the New Mexico MOST form, which is Medical Orders for Scope of Treatment. And we'll talk more about that over the course of our conversation today. So why don't we go ahead and, Dr. Gwynn, would you like to introduce yourself first?
Sure. I'm going to do a funny thing just before we introduce ourselves. I'd love to know what people are hoping to gain from this, and that will inform all of us as we start talking.
Okay.
And then happy to introduce myself at that point, but I thought we could start that way and get a sense. So what?
Just shout it out.
Shout it out. What does this title mean to you? Because it'll help me adapt what I talk about a little bit. And if you're welcome to say, go ahead.
Well, I've helped about 10 family members travel on, and I think I know a lot, so I'm here to find out what I don't know.
Okay. Does that cover it for other people too?
I think some of us have also been a part of that process, but to one degree or another. So it would be helpful to sort of do a soup to nuts with a emphasis on parts that people seem to know more, to need to know more about.
Good. Okay. Well, we can evolve from there and keep going. I'm Nancy Gwynn. I'm the medical director of several programs at Presbyterian involving care of people who are dealing with life-limiting illnesses, which includes palliative medicine. I very specifically define palliative medicine as being about living well. And I don't usually use the word die in my description for a very specific reason. People are really focused on living as long as they can with their life-limiting illness and making sure that their life is as high quality as possible. So it's that living well is the part that I focus on with palliative medicine. I also take care of, I have many programs at Presbyterian that involve taking care of fragile and medically fragile elderly people in their homes, and making sure that they also can get the care they need at home, rather than having to seek it out elsewhere in places they'd rather not be. And then also our hospice program, among other things. One of the programs we have that's part of the division I work in is an advanced care planning program, which is rolled out throughout Presbyterian in many different forms. And when I speak, I'm happy to talk about the documents we've created in order to be able to express your wishes as part of what I talk about.
My brother.
Oh, look, there you go
Handout.
for
I
the
did,
volunteer
I did,
facilitator
I did,
program.
yeah. Yep. So my name is Joan Gibson. I'm a philosopher by training, which means I don't do answers. So if you came expecting answers, I'll do my best. I started the ethics program at the medical school a number of years ago. I chaired the ethics committee, what was then St. Joseph Hospital, for 20 years. I'm not Catholic, I'm fallen by the wayside Presbyterian. And over the decades have been involved with many of my colleagues in what I consider to be the quest for the holy grail of advanced directives. And somehow if we could just find the perfect form, our living well until we don't would all be taken care of. I've had an epiphany in my old age, and so I've shifted my quest, and so the Holy Grail looks something different for me, and I'm going to share that with you in a bit.
Hi, and I'm Jan Wilson, and I'm a volunteer with Compassionate Choices, which is a national organization. Their mission is to improving care, expanding choices at the end of life. We do this kind of in three different arms, if you wish. Advocate, we support, and we educate. And I've spent the last 4 years mostly in the educate part. We go around to different conferences and have tables. You may have seen our table outside. That's kind of what we do at conferences. We have information available, and then we're there to explain things. And then there's a small group of us that go out and do presentations on advanced healthcare planning and directives. Like a lot of people do, it depends on who you know and where they hear about you. And so we figure if there's enough of us doing it, we should be able to reach everybody eventually. I don't know if that's quite true, but we go from working with people in book groups. We've had gone to really small groups, and I've spoken to 100 and more people at a Rotary. We do 30-minute presentations, like a real overview. We do an hour and a half workshop where we actually go through, we happen to use the Compassionate Choices materials, but we go through the directive and talk about what each of the sections means and try to answer questions. And I think I've learned a lot from having these workshops, because people tell me what they've experienced, and we try to figure out better ways to put down what we want so we have better odds at getting what we want or don't want at the end. Because even though we maybe can come up with the perfect form, unless people are willing to read it and listen to it, I'm not sure a perfect form really does the trick. No offense, but
Oh, I agree.
So we're here to help people just get through that whole process, and we use the materials from Dr. Gwynn and Joan. So we kind of combine a lot of the best of everything.
And I realized I didn't introduce myself. I'm Gail Rubin. I'm a certified thanatologist, which is a death educator. Death, not death. And I like to bring a light touch to what many consider a very serious subject, because laughter and humor enables us to break down that resistance to talking about this topic that we all need to talk about. And I also get to dress really fancy, like my new boots, sugar skulls. So yes, the doyen of death has an amazing skull wardrobe that helps get the conversation started. So I thank you all for coming here today, and why don't we start by talking about what is this magic advanced directive form that we're hoping people, or do you want to
Is
start
it,
with
no,
the
I
question?
wanted to ask about the microphone, because some of you project and some of you don't. Is that a microphone there, or is that just for your recording?
It's for the recording.
Oh, okay. so
I'll be
it doesn't-
happy to be louder.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah.
I wasn't sure what was
Set
going to
up
happen with
speaker
sound
at the
system.
end.
Okay.
Thank you for that.
So advanced directives, I think technically any of us can describe what they are. The glory of New Mexico is that we have one of the best advanced directive laws in the country, because we were the first to adopt what's called the Uniform Healthcare Decisions Act here in this state, which is fairly liberal and defines an advanced directive as could be a conversation with a healthcare professional that documents it, or it could be something written on a napkin that you have signed, literally.
Although I don't recommend that.
No, but I've put,
all you got.
yeah, really. Yeah, it doesn't require witnesses, it doesn't require a notary. However, I recommend that we use some of those tools. It's just literally, it's a great law, and it doesn't have a lot of rigidity, which has allowed us to, I think, create some of the documents we have created that are frankly more effective for people than in other parts of the country. So that's the document. I'm in total agreement with Joni that you can write down all you want, but the actual process really involves ensuring that you've had meaningful communication with the people who are essentially going to be making decisions for you no matter what you write down, at the point where you are no longer able to express yourself. And having the ability to express yourself and be understood and treated respectfully varies tremendously depending on what you have going on with you medically, right? So dementia gives you many years of no longer having capacity and being ignored by people who don't believe you are going to be legitimate in your expressions. And you can be someone like my mother, who was still telling me what to do a week before she died and was very clear about it and very decisional. So, there's a huge range of it there. So the document is critical, but I think all of us would agree that the conversation is the point.
Right.
I think that's where we all start and we end.
Mm-hmm.
At least when I do my presentations, that's what we do.
Sure. So I was thinking that talk therapy is maybe how I characterize my approach to this subject now, and picking up on many of you seem to have experience, practice in doing this. What lessons learned might get you to think about some additional things? So my current interest is focusing on the talk and focusing on the conversation. And 3 questions I'd like you to consider, and I'll touch on them as the afternoon progresses. What should we talk about? I will tell you that professionally, this is what I do. Our family lived with my husband's rheumatoid arthritis for 35 years. So we had practice on conversations, whether we wanted to or not. And so I've tried to draw from my personal experience as much as possible. So the first question I will consider is, what should we talk about? Advanced directives early on said, well, do you want to be on a ventilator? What about feeding tubes? What about antibiotics? And there were all these end-of-life medical treatment decisions that seemed to be the bulk of what really mattered. And if somehow you could just figure that out, all the rest of it would fall in place, which of course turned out not to be the case. The second question is, with whom? I talk to myself a lot. That is not always helpful when I can't speak for myself, which sometimes happens, much to my chagrin. So the second question is, with whom? And the third question is, when? When? So as we go on, I'll be talking a little bit about the what, the with whom, and the when. But it's about the talk.
And the how, with the tools that the Conversation Project provides.
Yep.
Yeah.
We will.
did you want to add anything to that?
I don't think I need to at this point,
Okay.
but, we do work with a form in my presentations, starting out with the values and what's meaningful to you. Because I think that's where you derive what treatments you might want when you, or if you get a certain diagnosis. And so we start with that, and we probably do go along with the form more than you do. Joan and I used to work together on different presentations, and she would do all the really touchy-feely, and I would get out the form and say, this is what you do. And that worked out really well, because I do think that you can talk all you want, but if you don't have it written down, there could end up being some problems. And that's the only reason we moved to, okay, the talk is great, what do you want? Write it down, and then tell everybody that what you wrote down. So it's kind of a cycle, and you just keep on going around and around and around.
And keep talking about it, because as you go through life and as health situations change, your attitude towards whatever you had written down and talked about before might change.
So I'm at the receiving end of those forms, which is what compelled me to craft some new forms. What I see on a day-to-day basis, of course, is the reaction of the medical community to forms as they come in and their interpretation of them. And that led me to work both in Presbyterian and in the community with some forms that at least I felt might have a chance of communicating in the medical language that is necessary when you want to move from a qualitative decision or a qualitative communication over to a medical communication. And in my mind, I kind of divide things into a couple different stages, and that's why, and I'll hand these out, that's why we crafted two different documents. One document I jokingly refer to as the healthy person's document, which means it's for all of us who really deeply don't really believe we're going to die, because part of being human is assuming you're not going to die. It's just normal. So it's written in the subjunctive, if I were ever to end up in that situation. And happy to hand this out for folks to take a look at. How many people have an advance directive? Yeah, I'm speaking to the converted. However, if you was
Only half of
prepared,
them.
if it was prepared by your attorney, I'm going to suggest that you should revisit it. And I actually give talks to attorneys about what doesn't work in a traditional form. The biggest philosophic change for me occurred. Can I give here? I've got plenty more. I was just handing a chunk out. Can I? The biggest philosophic change came for me as I was working with the traditional form, which is used by many attorneys about healthcare decisions. I'm not discussing financial or any other forms. And it's the traditional form that was suggested as a sample form in the Uniform Healthcare Decision Act. And what it says is that, in very rough terms, if it's decided that I have a condition that is progressive and that my course is short, and then you have to go between two boxes. I choose to prolong life, I choose not to prolong life. Which one do you pick? And what is fueling that decision? Well, there's been plenty of evidence at this point to indicate that if someone opts for hospice care, they're likely to actually survive longer than people who do not opt for hospice care with the same diagnosis. Big studies. And it really boils down to the fact that really good, high-quality supportive care focusing on comfort tends to, if anything, support life as much as it does not prolonging life. So what I end up saying is, well, actually, technically, given the condition you're in, you're choosing to prolong life if you opt for hospice, which left me in an incredible muddle with the old form. Because obviously what we're taught to tell people is, well, given the circumstance, you need to check that. I choose not to prolong life. And when I got to that point, I found myself unable to use the traditional form because of that conflict about my advice. I had to start helping write other forms. And so this form at Presbyterian, you can skip clear into the very middle section of it. And the language that we finally crafted and you were part of the conversation around crafting this language, is the following. If I reach a point where it is likely I will not recover my ability to interact meaningfully with my family, friends, and environment, I want to stop or withhold all treatments other than comfort care that might be used to prolong my existence. Treatments I would not want, if I were to reach this point, include but are not limited to tube feedings, IV hydration, respirator, ventilator, and antibiotics. That is what we now use instead of I would or I would not choose to prolong life, as a statement both of value, what's meaningful, and then a general statement about what kind of treatments. Because what I also don't want to put people through is sort of a menu list where it's like, I'll take A but not B, and I kind of would like C, because I will tell you right now that in those last weeks, months, having a very specific list of IV fluids, antibiotics, those are all very fluid things, and it's depending on, your medical condition drives that choice. If you have heart failure, IV fluids are a bad idea no matter what your attorney tells you, probably, because you probably are going to be overhydrated, not underhydrated. So that's what I mean about having a very specific medical list isn't as effective as a general statement like that says, pretty clearly, this is what I might want. Yes?
How do, say you're in the hospital for oncology or something, how does a DNR override this?
Hopefully it wouldn't. Well, there's two answers to that. Number one,
The specific incident I'm thinking of is somebody who had an allergic reaction coded, and they did CPR even though there was a DNR, which was appropriate and what he wanted. But I just wondered if that...
you mean being rescued from the allergy was appropriate?
That
Yeah.
was because he wasn't going to be long-term affected, but the doctors came out and said, oh my God, we just now saw the DNR, we shouldn't have done that.
So inside hospitals, you're dealing with medical orders that are highly specific. This document is a letter to a physician, not an absolute order on DNR, DNI, right? And so...
If there's a DNR in the chart, though.
If he was in the hospital and there was a DNR in the chart and there was a reaction, and he was intubated and also received cardiopulmonary resuscitation against his order, that was a medical error. And it just was. Now, the fact that you're telling me that the person came out of it and said thank you because I didn't really mean it that way.
That's exactly.
Yeah. And I've actually had 2 or 3. And was this someone you knew when you were there?
Oh, absolutely.
Okay, good.
I called the code.
Okay. So it happens definitely. And also you called the code because you're a nurse or because you were the family member who knew it was the right choice?
I'm an ex-PA, no longer licensed in the family member.
And you were the family member then?
And the family member
Yeah.
and brand new nurses didn't know what was going on.
Yeah. So basically the other thing that you're telling us about, which is a critical component, is that if you have a family member in the room, they will often challenge the document and override the wishes of the person, sometimes to advantage, sometimes to disadvantage, depending on the situation. That's the conversation part. You want to speak to it?
Along those lines,
I will.
I'm just reading this, the point at which is likely ability to interact meaningfully. There still seems to be a fair degree of interpretation left. So how do you sort of navigate that? I guess that's where the conversation comes in. But
Yeah.
it seems like there's certainly room
Yeah.
for interpretation there.
Well, I will tell you that this is the healthy person's subjunctive, if this ever happened to me, general statement. You can't get any more specific than that. If you have a life-limiting illness that has defined your time period to you to some extent, and that can be months, years, I strongly suggest that you get much more rigid about what you want and you don't want. That must take place with a medical professional. This document really requires it's not something you take home and fill out, it's something you do together with a medical professional and you both sign it. Because this one says, do not resuscitate. It also has a section in it which is choosing where you would want to receive care. And so it says, basically, comfort care only, do not transfer to the hospital, is one choice. Another choice is what I call hospital light, limited additional interventions. And that translates to, yes, the hospital, but not a lot. Maybe some fluids, maybe some antibiotics, that's all I want though, no intensive care. The third option is I want full core press intensive care. I want everything medical technology knows how to do. There's also sections about whether or not you would want tube feedings or artificial feedings if you required them. This is a document that is not very valuable when you are still living in the land of uncertainty, right? This is a hard one to have in place if what you're expecting to have happen to you in the next 10 years is more likely to be a fall or a motor vehicle accident. This is not for folks who are essentially healthy. That's this document, which leaves you in the land of uncertainty, but your value is pretty clearly stated there. The people around you are going to have the conversation about what's meaningful. I had a friend who had a stroke 2 weeks ago, and he was, they were giving him the clot busting agent, and there were some reasons why it was very dangerous for him, but the stroke had left him unable to speak, and he is a retired professor, and all of us said the same thing. Go for it. Because not speaking to him was, we all thought that he would much rather die than not speak and not be able to tell us things. And so the decision was very clear, and it was based on all of the knowledge of everyone who knew him, you know. Other people, it might not have been critical. If he'd been a painter, we might have been like hanging in there a little bit more. Yeah, but we all knew that not expressing himself. And he's come out with some limits to his ability to express himself that are extremely frustrating, but he is to the point possibly of recovering. So that was a values-driven choice.
In the late 80s, an epiphany in the advanced directive world. For about a decade, the very medically oriented advanced directives were being passed around. And in the late 80s, we began to ask the question, how do you answer, would I ever want to be on a respirator? And the answer, of course, is what?
Depends.
It depends. On what does it depend? And we began in the late 80s to focus on what it depends. I tend these days not to use the term values because it means too many different things.
It's been co-opted by
It's
other
been
people.
co-opted for other things. We're all values voters. But anyway, the patient's family is the expert on what their goals are, what they hope for, what they fear. Each of us right now, what makes us when we get up in the morning glad, generally, that we're alive. Only we know that. And the philosopher, teacher of logic in me says an absolutely essential premise in the syllogism of healthcare decision-making is what the goals, the hopes, the fears of the patient are. And without that, the medical diagnosis, prognosis, the available treatments are incomplete in the form for argumentation. Because I've had a stroke, it is possible that my speech can be brought back, but without that piece of being a professor for whom the ability to speak, I mean, I can understand some of you might in fact find reasons to shut that down, but if my values, the things that matter to me, really should carry the day, that always will be an incredibly important piece. So we developed the Values History Form, which was the first, before Five Wishes and other things, that focused not exclusively, but initially and importantly on what's important to you. What makes life worth living to you today? I can tell you I have no idea what my answer is going to be 10, 15 years from now. But I can tell you what matters today. And if something happens and I collapse, Dr. Gwynn will say, well, you know, the last time Joan and I talked, here's what she said really mattered to her. And so if I filled out the advanced directive form and there are those guidelines there, to be able to say to the doctor, this is the last message she gave us about what she really hoped for, what she was afraid of. So it is not to take the place of the forms, of the documents, or the suggested medical treatments that I would or would not want. But just know that that piece of what matters to us is absolutely critical. That gets to the what do I talk about piece. And Nancy knows this, Jan knows this. My favorite recent story is a palliative care physician whose father was going in for surgery the next day. They had not had the conversation. She was chagrined. She talked to him that night and said, "This is really embarrassing, but Dad, if anything happens, what should I know about you?" And he said, "Well, I love chocolate ice cream. And I really like looking at football on television." And she thought, well, that's really helpful. But that was as good as she was going to get that night. Next day in surgery, he had an internal bleed, and the physician's story to the man's daughter, the physician, was, if we fix it, he'll be paralyzed. If we don't, he'll die. What do we do? And she said, well, if you fix it, what are the chances that he'll be able to enjoy chocolate ice cream?
And watch football.
And watch football. And the doctor said, well, really quite good. Well, she said, I guess you better go ahead and do it. And they did, and he was glad. And it's actually, I think it's in Atul Gawande's book on being mortal. But I ask you to think about, what is your today, your chocolate ice cream moment? What is your football on television moment? That is an incredibly important bit of information to give to your families and friends. So my first question, what do we talk about? That is the sort of thing. And it's today. And then tomorrow, if something happens and suddenly it's peppermint ice cream, tell your family. Tell them.
And I'd like to just add in something that I use a lot now in my presentations in the Compassion Choices Toolkit, which is out there. They have a form, and they do list a lot of the different treatments or possibilities like ventilators and hydration. And they have a, yes, I do want this. No, I don't want this. And then, well, maybe. And if you put a well, maybe, you kind of leave it up to the doctor that if there's a chance of coming through, and it would happen because you were on that ventilator for a week, then that's what you want. No, I don't want to be on a ventilator for the next 6 months, possibly. But if you write down absolutely no ventilator, because in your mind you're thinking, I don't want to be in a bed with a ventilator for the last 6 months of my life, and that 1 week of being on it is going to mean you can go home, well then try not to write those absolutes unless you have a except when or something like that. And we go through this kind of thing because there's a lot of times if you just ask me, no, I don't want this. But then I think of my mother who was on a ventilator for a week and went back home. Or she had something else and went back home and lived very happily for 6 months. But she had always said, I don't want to be on one for the rest of my life, if that's what it turns out to be. So I think there is a way that you have to weigh certain things. And once you get a diagnosis, perhaps, that's the time you can be more specific and a little more rigid. But as we're being healthy, don't put down something that you may regret either.
Well, but do help your family, if you are living with a diagnosis that is short-term, terminal, do help your family. Yeah. Do be brave. Because it's just so critical not to leave them with those final hard decisions. And many of you are nodding because you've been there with family members. So that's a time where you do get a little rigid. Not rigid, but you just say, look, I really, really, really don't want that. A colleague of mine who works a lot in hospice talks about the idea that we're walking down a hallway and doors are opening. And what she says is, which door do you want to use? And when we're dealing with people who have a terminal illness, who are frail, some of the conversation is sooner or later something's going to happen. What do you want to do with that something? That infection, that pneumonia, that thing. And if we always look for a rescue. If there's always a chance, another few more days. Sometimes you're opting for a less pleasant door, a worse door, and a much harder door for family. So as I said, when you're a healthy person with no diagnosis that is life-limiting, then it's fine to live in the subjunctive. But at the point where you're really dealing with these things, being clear with family about what you want and don't want. And, the list of medical treatments isn't as much it as really expressing your wishes. So the farmer that I spoke to who is in Socorro, who had a new diagnosis, mild dementia, new diagnosis of lung cancer, family brought him up, we sat together, and I said, what is he, I asked him, but I also asked the family, what does he like to do? Well, he likes to get in the car and drive around and look at the animals, and he likes to sit in the back of the house and watch the yard to make sure everything's okay. Neither one of those choices, neither one of those values was consistent to driving up to Albuquerque for chemotherapy, right? I mean, the thought of even getting in a car and driving up, in fact, they weren't even in Socorro, they were further south than that. The family luckily understood that each one of those days that we spent in the chemotherapy suite was one day less of looking at the animals or sitting on the back. So they made a really elegant choice with him and for him around the idea. They just kind of disappeared back down. They didn't even tell they didn't, it's so embarrassing to have to tell all these doctors that you don't want something they're offering you. So they just kind of faded back to their hometown. I checked in with their primary. It was clear that they'd had a communication, and they just went back home to do what they were going to do. And it was just such an elegant choice because they had understood that they might be giving something up, but what they were giving up might not, what was the price they were going to pay for that extension? It was all those days that he could have.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
So that's another subjunctive that shouldn't exist. And that subjunctive is, well, if I had a choice, one does have a choice, and one can say no. And I know a number of my physician colleagues always say, of course you could say no. But it is part of the culture of patients and families to, I'm not sure I really can say no. So get rid of the subjunctive there and recognize that you can say no. Wonderful segue to question number 2. When should we have this conversation? And being the Zen person that I am, the answer is now. The past is gone forever. The future never comes. And the only time we can have a conversation is right now. Now, we can sort of figure down the road, if this, but it is the right now that really matters. The Conversation Project started 5 years ago by Ellen Goodman, and she was a columnist for the Boston Globe, and before she retired, her mother was in the early stages of, I think, although I don't know they could make an exact diagnosis, probably Alzheimer's, certainly serious progressive dementia. And Ellen Goodman said, I'm an only child, I'm going to be your decision maker. It's really important, Mom, that we talk about what matters to you. And her mother was the sort, according to Ellen, who would talk your problem to death. You would be so tired of your problem, you would say, okay, I give up, I'm getting rid of it. She'd never talk about herself. And one day, Goodman said, I was on deadline, the doctor called, said, Ellen, your mother has pneumonia again, do you want to give her antibiotics? And Ellen said, can I get back to you on that? And she was quite embarrassed about that. But when she retired, she thought, I want somehow to marshal resources that are available to people where we eat, where we work, where we play, where we pray, that really speak to the practical exigencies of decision making. And so she started the Conversation Project. One of the hows, Gail, I have out there for you to pick up. They have a lot of free downloadable resources on how to have conversations. I have just a 2-pager starter kit, things to think about to begin talking about now what matters to you. There's a card about our local New Mexico Conversation Project. We have a website, the national folks have a website. All the materials are free. You can download them. They're translated into 16 languages. So if Mandarin Chinese is your language of choice, you can have many of these documents in that form. But the when, and the when is now. How many of you plan to be alive tomorrow morning? I certainly do. And it's one thing to think, now, were I ever seriously ill and the most form would be available. How many of you have checked on your driver's license, I am an organ donor? Okay. How many of you have talked to your family about what that means to you? Okay. So, here's a young man, Craig, 17 years old. My husband got a kidney from him. Craig had signed, he'd checked on his driver's license, that he was an organ donor. And he was riding his bike with a helmet on and all the latest equipment up in Angel Fire and shredding down the mountain and smashed into a tree and exploded his skull despite the helmet. He had checked he was an organ donor, but just like Ellen Goodman, who said, I wish I had my mother's voice in my ear, Craig's mother said, I wish I had Craig's voice in my ear. The mother, the father, the 2 siblings had to come to Angel Fire from Colorado and make the decision to donate organs. Things can happen in an instant, and they're not always of this magnitude of tragedy, but the urgency of talking and at least giving our loved ones our voices in their ear, even if it's just about chocolate ice cream. I can't overemphasize the gift and the practical, what's the right noun? It really helps in the decision making, because if you have to try and weigh, my God, is it a ventilator? What do we do? But to be able to say to the doctor, here's what was really important to my loved one. Here's what just made her light up. Now, given that profile that I can somehow communicate to you, you know the condition, you know the available treatments. What is the best way to celebrate and honor that person?
I totally agree with you, Joan, and that's one of the things that we push. I was just at the Primetime Expo this week, and my colleague Jean in the back usually does all the tabling, but I did it this time. And people would come up and I'd say, do you have an advance directive? Have you talked to anybody about it? They say, oh no, I'm healthy. I'm young. Some of them are saying that and they're 80 years old, but whatever. And I said, have you driven on the Albuquerque streets recently? Have you looked at the paper? You don't know what's going to happen. And that's beyond going to your doctor, and that little pain that you had is more than just a little pain. So I keep on trying to push, and the hardest thing is to talk to anybody under 55 or 60, because they are definitely going to live forever. But whatever you can do, since a lot of you have already done this whole process, or at least part of it, I don't know if you've talked to everybody, is encourage all the younger people in your family or that you know that this is the time to do it. You don't have to wait till you're 55 and get your ARP card or whatever. You know, now is the time because we don't know.
What do you do though when the kids say, "Oh, don't be morbid"?
I have an answer. Oh my God. Oh, I'm going to write an answer. And I have them out there. So I've been working because this obviously speaks to me on a very personal level. And young people have to make healthcare decisions all the time, not end-of-life decisions, but they blow a knee out skiing Taos, double black diamond. You know, we have babies. Young women get breast cancer. I mean, we're faced with all sorts of decisions and learning how to become skilled decision makers and communicating to others about right now, here's what really matters to me. Do I want breast reconstruction? Am I happy? You know, I can shoot my bow and arrow much more easily. But what I have found is focus on, so if something happened to you right now and you blew your knee out, who knows you best? Who would you want to have speak for you? And just focus on that. And they will do that quite willingly. And I've got a little card out there, a wallet card, that just says, you know, if I can't speak for myself, here is the person to contact, their name, their phone number. And they will do that without any problem. And then, if you get to see them the next time, oh yeah, what should we talk about? What should I tell them? What do they need to know? But if you're really looking for the behavioral prompt, use the identification of a medical companion, a decision maker. That they get. That we all get, actually. And it works for geezers my age as well. So out there's a little wallet card. Let me just ask you this. How many of you have adult children? Grandchildren? Young friends, 25 or older? Yeah. How many of you know what their wishes are? That, I think, is the upstream or downstream. I forget which way the metaphor goes. But that is incredibly important, and it doesn't have to be just around end-of-life decision-making, but learning the skills to identify the flavor of ice cream I like today in case somebody has to order for me. That you can do. Yes?
I want to go back to Raccoon for a moment. I've come up against a couple of times people who, you keep talking about family, people who do not want their family involved.
Oh, absolutely. If I did...
I don't see a place in here where it says not this person and that person.
I was actually going to say, if you don't want that brother from California that you haven't spoken to in 10 years to make medical decisions for you, do make sure you find someone who you do want and complete this document. Any healthcare, any advanced healthcare directive has two components to it. The first one is naming your agent, and that is the part that I actually recommend that you do for sure. And communicating with that agent and letting them know ahead of time that you've picked them is always a good idea. So it's the same idea, the healthcare companion, the healthcare agent, and this form, this form, which is the legal form for New Mexico, basically allows you to pick someone, allows you to pick an alternate, and then indicates on the next page what their authority is. Can they make decisions for you now, or can they make decisions after you lose decisional capacity? You take that step and think through that one. And that is variable depending on how much you trust the person and how advanced you are in illness. But in general, most people make the choice to make the decision maker's authority effective only at the point where it's been decided you do not have decisional capacity. And then you also can set limits as to what kind of decisions they make. Though I will tell you right now, if you get super rigid on this, we're going to end up in one of those horrible boxes in the hospital where we're unable to move forward or have to second guess. But basically, you can set some very specific limits about whether or not they're allowed to make decisions about nursing home needs, orders to resuscitate, things like that. But
It never says who you don't want. This is, I do not want.
you can write that down.
Yeah.
Remember, you
Put
can
anything
write
you
your
like.
advance directive down on a
Anything you want.
napkin and sign it.
And you can put
say
that-
all
in the
over this,
hospital,
yes.
Right.
Because the hospital where I live goes to family first.
Legally,
That's absent something written down.
well, we do go to family first if nothing else is
Yeah.
available. So I think the critical components of good advanced care planning from the health system perspective are that, number one, you urge people to create documents early, which is what we've been working on. Number two, you find a great way to store those documents so they're easily available, and then you honor those documents. So the three-part program I've been working on at Presbyterian involves actually working with primary care and specialty services to ask people 18 or older to complete an advance directive. Secondly, we built a program to scan it into the medical record and have it accessible right up there next to allergies. If we want to know someone's allergies, we want to know their advance directive. And third, we audit to ensure that those advance directive documents are honored. So that's the goal, and a really good system, the North Star for this entire process is Gunderson Lutheran out of La Crosse, Wisconsin. And they have done 2 retroactive studies. The advanced, and of everyone who died in that county, the advance directive was available. The person had an advance directive 90% of the time, and basically 99% of the time they found it and they honored it. So but that was started in the early 90s, and that small community has been working on it ever since. That's the goal. That documents are always available and always honored.
And
So
Jan went
you
to
can
the-
write down, not my brother-in-law, I don't care. Yeah, anybody but. But the important point usually is if you're proactive about who you do want, they'll move to those folks
Yeah.
quickly.
And as Dr. Gwynn mentioned, make sure that the person you pick, you've talked to that person and they know. And also, I would recommend, or we recommend when I give out presentations, that you tell perhaps that person you don't want, this is my directive, and as you see, I've picked so-and-so as my healthcare proxy or whatever you want to call them. And to tell you the truth, I don't have any of my family on mine because they're so far away. I see them twice a year. My good friends know me so much better. But I've sent them copies. So they do know what I've written down, even though they now are spared from having to worry about coming and making any decisions. I think they're just as happy, actually. But that's, something to do is to make sure several people have the copies, not just the proxy and your doctor.
I've actually written a document that says these are my decision makers, but they're and their family members, but I strongly advise them to accept help from the following palliative care physicians. And I've notified both of those folks to expect a call from my family members who have agreed that they will need assistance in understanding the situation. So they have a list of people to call.
Well, and when
Some of whom are younger than I am, which is useful.
And when you have an elderly couple, usually the spouses are making each other the decision maker, and that can raise some issues. I'm sure you've seen that a lot. It happened within my own family, and my mother-in-law had to make a decision for the last ER admission of my father-in-law. Would he be admitted on palliative care? And then she didn't want to make that decision. And so she turned to my husband and I, and me being the doyen of death, I'm like, palliative care, yeah, let's do it. And it was the right decision because he did not want his life extended in, ways that he was ready to go. And we were able to make that happen. But what do you all think about, making your spouse your decision maker?
Right now, I have my spouse because we've talked about it a lot, and I know I can trust him. However, he also knows that if he's in no condition to make that decision, because of emotional reasons or whatever, that the two friends that I've picked, that they would do it, because we've all talked back and forth a lot, and so that makes me feel good, because 9 times out of 10, if I'm going to be traveling or something, he's going to be with me, and therefore is right there, and so that makes it a little bit easier, if he can handle it at that point. But I've had people say, but I've really got to put down my oldest daughter. She would never forgive me if she wasn't made proxy. And I said, well, this is your life and or your death, depending on how you want to look at it. And maybe what you need to say is, I love you so much that I don't want to put you in that position. Now that may work for some families, it may not. We're only trying to increase the odds here of getting what you want. But some people, they really worry about that. Or if I pick, Susie, I've also got to have the other 5 children on there. I can't imagine what that could be like.
Oh, I've lived it many times. We put a special section on this form that honors that, and what it says is, persons I want my healthcare decision maker to include in the decision process. And it allows people to write every family member down. But what it says is, I ask that my healthcare decision maker make a reasonable attempt to include the following people in my healthcare decisions if there is time. However, I understand that all final decisions must be made by my healthcare decision maker. So for people with a lot of kids, it gave them a chance to emotionally list everyone and not feel as though they were excluding. So it was a supportive way to acknowledge how big families can be.
One of the recent resources that the Conversation Project put up online is how to select and how to be an effective healthcare proxy. And it's one thing, it's important that the person understands you, be willing to follow your wishes if that's really important. It's also important that they can navigate that environment. And I think that is one capacity that maybe we've ignored a bit, but it's a pretty daunting environment if you've not really been in a hospital, an intensive care unit, and had these hordes coming in and going out. And so selecting people who are educable and fortified enough to be able to do that is important as well, and going to become increasingly so. So you can go to the website and download that resource. Just from a human point of view, we are really good in our culture at avoiding conflict and causing it. And we do both of those extremely well. And even in the most sympathetic families, a serious illness can expose really icky stuff. And part of it is unavoidable, but you can deal with sort of the anticipatory ick stuff. And you can get some of the conflict surfaced earlier on by bringing these subjects up. It's not pleasant. We avoid it a lot. But you can, for basically healthy families, just get some of that out early on. I mean, I'm guilty of it as well. If you don't do it, I can promise it all comes out in the ER, the ICU, and it's not helpful. Some of it inevitably will come, but pick the low-hanging conflict fruit, and early conversations can deal with some of that.
Question. So I assume these are transferable across hospital systems, but are they portable across states also?
It's interesting.
No.
No.
No. You wouldn't want life to be simple. So I actually think that if someone is migrating back and forth between two states, I usually recommend they complete documents in both states that are similar. I also suggest if you live in New Mexico, which is so liberal, and you are going to be spending time out of state, that you consider having the document witnessed and notarized, just because I think there'll be greater effect elsewhere. I think in most systems nowadays, I think you've got a very good chance if you show up with a nice document to have it be honored. We had a family situation where a family member was looking like they were going to end up with surgery down in MD Anderson, and the first thing I did was hit the lawyer's office because I knew that in Texas they didn't have a Uniform Healthcare Decision Act in place, and we crafted something that had lots of language and signs and seals and everything to hand carry down there because I didn't want to end up in a turf war about an advance directive. So I prepared ahead of time. But in general, and there are plenty of stories of this not working, but I think in general a well-spoken healthcare agent waiving a nicely crafted document will have impact.
Mostly, professionals are grateful to have help.
Yeah.
Really.
Yeah.
And my lawyer friends taught me that hard cases make bad law. And we tend to focus on the really extremely difficult cases. But for the most part, it's the general dwindles that get us, and that we can take care of, and people can speak on our behalf, and that's an essential start.
But it can be really helpful. My poor husband, I use him as my prime subject a lot of times. And we were on vacation in Arizona a couple of years ago, and all of a sudden he wasn't feeling quite right. Called the Blue Cross Blue Shield hotline, and the woman said, chew up 2 aspirin and call 911, just right now. And they came, and they took him right up to Tucson because he was having heart problems. Turns out he ended up with a quintuple bypass. But the point of my whole story really is I got to follow the ambulance 50 miles up to Tucson in my car, and for some reason I happened to follow my own advice that I give in presentations and had our advanced directives in the glove compartment. And as I drove into the parking lot, I pulled it out, and as I was going in, of course, the first thing I think they asked, well, I'm not sure. They might have asked if we had insurance first.
Yes.
But the second thing maybe was, do you have an advanced directive? And I said, yes, and here it is. Well, they took that and they just escorted me right down to where he was. And I don't know what would have
They
happened.
were deeply
if I had...
thankful, and they couldn't believe it.
And,
They hadn't seen that in a long time.
and nobody came to me and said, well, this isn't the one we use here at this
Yeah.
hospital or anything like that.
Yeah.
But so it as you said, if it's written and well written and not saying really absurd things, I think you can probably get away with it in a lot of places, even if it's slightly different.
This document, which is called the Medical Orders for Scope of Treatment, is a document that is known as a POLST type document nationally. It was started in Oregon in the early 90s, and most states have a version of it. What's really intriguing about this one is that in many states, because the advance directive law is different than the New Mexico, this is merely a physician order set. This is literally physician orders around your scope of treatment. It has to be signed by a physician. In some states, it can be signed by a nurse practitioner or PA. It's variable. And it's a directive. It's a physician order about how you should be treated. Here in this state, we treat it as an advance directive and ask that you co-sign it, because in this state, this is another healthcare decision. And because we are so liberal, we honor these types of documents as your healthcare decision. So as you move from state to state, this document also has some interesting implications. Again, if someone's going to be around who has one, I would craft one for each location.
Hi, I was curious. I cared for an elderly man, and he has that on the refrigerator. And I was wondering, is that something I could make a copy of and have in the vehicle as I travel with him? Or is it best just to be at home? I'm just curious.
I would make a copy of that document and keep it with you, absolutely. And he's co-signed it, so it's also his advance directive, so that's really valuable,
Yeah.
right? Assuming he had decisional capacity when it was crafted.
Yes.
Then he would have signed it. Yeah, and a copy of it would be brilliant. You can even get another bright green one from whomever is taking care of him, but you want to make sure they've signed it also. It adds that slight weight of medical authority to his wishes,
It's
which I find,
original.
I like having both people on it because sometimes hospitals are more inclined to look at the fact that there is both a medical professional and a person signing it. They shouldn't, but they do. Yeah.
Those don't have to be notarized.
No.
While we're on that topic, I was curious, are there other documents that are important or helpful of having with you as you travel? I mean, just around New Mexico or throughout the U.S., not international travel, but I'm healthy and don't have any diagnosis, but just as a good idea to kind of protect you or make things flow easily in the event that you were injured or...
I think it's great to have a medication list, a perfectly accurate medication list. You can't believe how hard that is to come by when people are in crisis. And if you really do have a medical, if you're traveling with this gentleman who obviously has medical conditions, it doesn't hurt to have a list of his conditions and a list of his physicians or specialists and the medications. And that would really be very helpful if you're in crisis in a community to get medical care that was appropriate, as well as this document.
Do you have an iPhone?
Yeah, there is.
The Heart, the health app that comes automatically on your iPhone. And it's a medical ID. And so if you go in the little pink heart app, click on it, go to the medical ID, you can put as much or as little information in there. I have my blood type, I have my daughter's name as my decision maker, I have her phone number, and I have a statement that says, Robin Gibson is authorized to make any and all healthcare decisions on my behalf. The beauty of that is that on the locked screen of your iPhone, even if it's locked, EMTs know they can go to where it says emergency, and it will get them into that information, and increasingly all EMTs know that. Android, you can download an app, but it's a little more complicated. We're hoping that Androids will do what iPhone has done, but that is a wonderful way. Mostly for emergency situations, my experience has been it's kind of like Ghostbusters. All they want to know is who are you going to call. They want to know the name and the phone number, and it's up to us then to provide those people whom they're going to call with the information. Don't expect, you're traveling with your briefcase full of all of these things. I mean, that might ultimately help, but it's just as useful to have somebody be the keeper of those documents, and they just want to know who's your contact and are they authorized.
I have a separate app on my phone which is done by the ABA, which is my healthcare wishes, and you can upload your advance directive onto it.
Right, do you have an Android?
No, I have an iPhone, but it's a downloadable. I believe that there's Android available.
American Bar Association?
Yeah, it's called My Healthcare. I can find it again. I found it while we were talking, and then immediately. It's called My Care Wishes. It's the second little. It's red also, like the health app. So that's another one you can use. I was thinking about the fact that we had traveled cross country for complex surgery, and again, another case where we needed a good advance directive, and got there and went through the whole process and got home, and my husband had brought his advance directive to make sure everyone knew his wishes, and only when we got home did I realize he was carrying mine around with him, not his, and it made me laugh. It was fine. We were fine. Everything was fine. But,
What's the difference between an advance directive and a living will? Are they the same, are they in subset?
Great question. So a living will is going to document your wishes. It's another way to say I would like or not like certain things. It doesn't often incorporate designating the healthcare decision maker. So if you think about the two parts, there's designating your healthcare decision maker and then saying what you would like. And those are two critically slightly different things. You can designate your healthcare decision maker and say, I'm not going to choose anything, ask them. So the living will doesn't always incorporate designating what we call the healthcare power of attorney or healthcare decision maker, healthcare agent, all the same words. All the same.
Yes, yeah.
That way, as far as maybe having more, I guess, force where something happens not state.
It's just a question of reading through the document that's been created and making sure that it has both parts to it. Living will is an old phrase at this point, and we've kind of steered away from it.
Historically, that was the first thing we thought about was, oh my gosh, there are all these treatment decisions now that present themselves that weren't available before the technology. And so historically, we focused on those end-of-life decisions. And then following that, the importance of having an authorized decision maker came. And so historically, we've kind of moved along that trajectory. Now there is the umbrella of advanced directives that are the who and the what.
You know, as a military retiree,
You
I've had...
you had to.
Had to do that.
You had to do it,
It seems
absolutely.
to have equal, force and effect anywhere in the world for something to happen.
Absolutely.
So
That's
it's
it.
kind of advantage as far as anywhere you go.
Yeah, and not
That's
only
right.
that, we can sometimes find your medical records
Right.
across any system, which is valuable.
Yeah.
What I love about this conversation project document, just to remind folks, is this is not just about ventilators. It's literally about how much medical information I'd like to receive. And I would like to know a lot. I'd like to know a little. I want to be involved in every decision. I don't. I mean, those are the qualitative things that I usually ask people about as we're actually having medical conversations. How long do you want to receive medical care? How comfortable are you? Would you like to be? Really, I mean, I'd like to stay home, and that's my choice. I think going to the hospital is critical to me because it will help me live longer. I mean, really basic questions like that are
Right.
really valuable to know about.
That sheet's out there.
Yeah.
Yeah, you'll find out on the table there. And look at all of this and familiarize yourselves with sort of the range of things to think and talk about, and then craft the package that works best for you. The most important thing, name and authorize a person, probably have a backup. If you and your husband are traveling and you're both in an automobile accident and your husband can't speak for you, who is the backup person? And then think about what do you want that person to know about you? Those are the two main categories of conversation starters.
A fair question. Is a power of healthcare power of attorney the same thing as a medical director? I've assumed it was. Is it?
Part of what you're doing is you're designating
Yeah.
your healthcare power of
But
attorney.
it's the equal. They're equal across the board when they hit the bureaucracy.
If you're,
corporate world.
yeah, so a healthcare directive can be your choices for your healthcare. And that is a parallel document to creating someone who will speak for you if you're unable to speak for yourself, right?
But you don't need both.
Well, it depends. Do you want actually to share information about, in one case, and literally it's broken into pages here to make it as simple as possible. This page is about, sorry, it's right there. This page is about who will speak for you if you're unable to speak for yourself. This next page is about what you would like done. You do not have to ever list off anything about what you would like or not like, but the more information you give the world, the better, right?
Yeah.
But it is equal to if you had gone to the lawyer and gotten power of attorney for health care, having your advance directive, as far as I know, is equal to that.
That's what
Yeah.
Right.
Each
But-
document is superseded by the previous one. It's a critical point.
Yes.
The dates is what matter. And
Yep.
I have been in situations where I've had to lay out 3 documents, each naming a different person.
Oh, man.
And I pick the most recent one.
Have to.
Yeah, you have to, and that's what I'm supposed to do.
Right.
So be very clear that when you execute a document, whether it's this one or the green one, you are superseding your previous wishes.
What about
Both your
the-
agent and your wishes.
The 5 wishes form, which is used broadly across the country. Differences, helpful?
I have something that maybe won't be related to that. New Mexico, we all know, is a frequent vacation or retreat destination for people. I have a brother-in-law with stage 3 pancreatic cancer. He just went through a long period of chemotherapy, so I have a couple of questions. One is, if they come to visit me, is there a framework for conversation before they do about what they need to bring with him? Because he's not stage 4, he could be fine for a while. The level of openness around his condition and what could happen with it at any time is variable. So I guess when I'm asking it, there are a lot of gray areas in all this. And how do we kind of flip it and just say, okay, so these folks are coming to see me, I'm not going to see them. They're coming to see me. Obviously they have their insurance company. But is there a framework for approaching conversations around that kind of scenario?
So you're dealing with someone who really is facing their own mortality in a way that's not hypothetical. And so I would say the first thing is delicacy. And so if they do not need to show up in this state with a document. They're coming, they're traveling, he'll probably be able to express his wishes. I think he's probably traveling with his healthcare decision maker. You're going to be the pinch hitter if something happens, and you may need to help translate. But what you don't want to do in his situation is sort of tell him to make sure to bring his advance directive with him before he visits.
I get that, but I just want
So really, the way I open conversations with people when they come in to speak to me is I start with, tell me your story. Tell me your understanding of what's going on. And that informs all the rest of what we talk about. And so that would be what I would do when he arrives. Not before he arrives, unless you can have a long conversation, but when he arrives, what's going on? Tell me the story. And if he'll open and talk about it, then I suspect by the end of that, you will have a very clear understanding of what he wants and doesn't want. And so, of course, part of what we all want is we want to survive the pancreatic cancer. So, of course. Okay. So sometimes we talk about our plan B. Plan A is survive the cancer. What's plan B? Or it may be a reference to treatments and how it's going. The last episode of chemotherapy just, I spent 2 weeks in bed afterwards and I'm feeling horrible. Or I'm sailing through it and I'm doing really well. That's useful information. Hospitalizations. How did it go last time? How are you doing with that? Yeah, and people start telling you things that are incredibly valuable to understand, that are how medical decision making is really informed. My job as a palliative care physician is to take that conversation and translate it into actionable documents. That's what I do. The translation from meaning and value, the rancher in Socorro, the stage 3 pancreatic cancer, chemotherapy's going great, let's go for it. Or I am exhausted. And so then the conversation is about how do we talk about being exhausted and what does that mean, Yeah, when's the next CT scan? What's that going to be like? Yeah, the impact is just huge. So,
And as
you
a
can only
family
go as far as you can go.
Right.
Yeah.
And as a family member, so just let me know what we can do to be of help. Just from a purely family living situation, just let us know what can be of help to you. And what Nancy said, I think that our brains are hardwired to be storytellers. And if you want to know how do you start a conversation, either tell or invite a story. And if you do that, it pops. But checklists are deadly, as it were.
But I'd like to get back to your question, Gail, about the 5 wishes. I think the appeal of that form is that it incorporates a lot of the non-medical wishes into it. There's a whole section on I'd like to have
How I'd
certain
like to be
music,
treated.
how I
Yeah.
want to be treated, and that kind of
My
thing.
favorite, and the idea is you cross out anything you don't
Don't
agree
want.
with.
Right.
And one of them is, I'd like to be massaged with warm oils as often as possible. Don't wait until you're dying to get a good massage.
Yeah. But also, I'd like to point out it is more religious oriented, and there is a part in there. I can't remember exactly what it's page 7, or I used to know that exactly. But it says, despite everything I've said here, I don't want to. I want to extend my life as long as possible, or something to that effect. So if you use that form, and if that's not what you want, be sure to cross it out and initial it.
And does that mean joining hospice or not joining hospice? You see, that's exactly the reason I
Right,
stopped
right.
using forms.
So
The other issue with 5 wishes is that it very clearly indicates that you're supposed to have witnesses and notaries because it's a national form, and that honors, so the state law in many states compels that. So it's been confusing for people.
yeah,
It's also a complicated, long document. What we try, and you have to pay for it, it's true, as an
Right.
institution, but what we tried to do in this document was kind of leave some space for a bit of the touchy-feely, but not quite as much as 5 wishes. So it says things like, when I am nearing my death, I want the following. Please list any care or rituals you might want. It allows people to talk about where they would want to be, where would you like to be cared for, you know, and so there's some space. There's a request to share faith with us and the name of the faith community. So we were trying to incorporate some general information and try to get as much information as we could, but without quite the explicit list of 5 wishes.
and if you really want to, you can just write another page
On the
and
napkin.
staple it to your advanced
Absolutely.
directive.
Yeah.
And just make sure you copy that page when you make copies of your advanced directive, so everybody knows what you want.
Has anyone
really
ever
want
worked
that
in the field of
massage.
obstetrics here? No? Okay, because part of my training was in obstetrics because I'm family medicine trained. We used to be a little nervous when someone came in with a 17-page birth plan, usually for the first delivery, because
Give me drugs.
that was never on it. It was much more complicated than that, because it was always like, oh no, I don't know if it's going to go just this way. We were just talking about that. So yes, write a list but be aware that flexibility is part of life.
Yes.
Yeah. But the birth plans, sometimes they were long and complicated and you would always be scared.
Here's the opposite end of the chocolate ice cream. So I had a gentleman, we were trying to figure out what to talk about. And I said, so just, what really worries you about your care? He's 6'5", and he said, I hate having tight sheets around my feet. And I know that even if I am not with it, if my feet are squeezed, I'm going to be miserable. I mean, that's really important for somebody to know. My mother told me, I had no idea, she's mildly claustrophobic, and she said, Joan, if I can't speak for myself and somebody wants to put me through some kind of MRI machine, if I am the least bit conscious, I'm going to go crazy. So please, just don't do that. Now that sounds kind of silly, but that's practical information.
I'm smiling because I knew your
Yes,
I knew
yes,
about
yes.
your family was not making
Really?
it was, your
Hospice
mother.
people, they've got to bring more longer beds sooner.
Oh,
I
yes.
know. I was just taking care of someone who was hanging off the end. Yeah, and we were in the emergency room, and he was like that far over the bed. I did want to not forget to mention this
Yes.
program, and there are leaflets for it out on the table. This is a new program that Well, but you're
Designed.
doing it, yeah. It's a volunteer group of advanced directive and advanced care planning facilitators. So these are community-based folks such as Joan Gibson, and a number of really other incredibly highly qualified people who are available as volunteers to meet with people who want to work on creating, and it doesn't have to be this document, but this is the one we use most often. And if you pick up a leaflet, there's actually a number there, and you can call and arrange an appointment, and they're very cool folks.
It's fabulous.
And they love spending the time. And
We take an hour, hour and a half.
Yeah.
It's sponsored by Pres, but you don't have to have anything to do with Presbyterian. And you call and make an appointment. We have a great time because it's sort of like going to therapy. Once you choose to do this, you've done 75% of the heavy lifting. I want to ask you one thing because when I talk with people, this when do I want the authority of my healthcare proxy to kick in? One option is it kicks in when I kick out, meaning when my decisional capacity goes, then my healthcare proxy can speak. It's my understanding that if I say it becomes effective now, that person doesn't have the authority to trump me, but they can be essentially an equal partner in the discussion and the receipt of information. And
I'm squirming a little because I'm not an attorney and
I
I'm
know.
going to speak as if I was.
No,
one.
don't.
So I'm channeling all the senior law folks who helped me build this document.
That's right.
But
And-
that's how I understand it.
And
also.
I've checked right now, and that is it's determined by two things. One, the person whom I've picked, I trust. And number two, I know what it's like to be a patient and to be sick. And I might be in my right mind, but I feel like you know what. And it is such a relief, a balm, if you will, to have somebody there who isn't always being questioned. Should she be here? Does she have the authority to take part in this? We've not had any difficulty. My husband might check that. And it just made the family, me for him and my daughter for me, kind of an equal partner in this. And it let me be the patient and let him be the patient. So that's something to think about and talk about. And I didn't mean to make you squirm, but I think it's important. You want to make this as easy as possible.
Well, don't forget that people can lose capacity temporarily,
Yeah, yeah.
and it actually says that in this document. It says, so if you choose, I do not want my healthcare decision maker to have authority until I lose capacity. Realize that could be a temporary situation, and you may regain capacity. It's not that you have cognitive decline or dementia. It could be that you've been in an accident, and there's going to be a few days where you're not really able to make decisions. I often work, if I'm working with folks who are elderly, frail, their child is going to be a decision maker or the decision maker, we'll discuss whether or not it'd be nice to have the authority effective immediately just so that they can trade the roles off as needed, and they often endorse that. And it's a bit of a relief for them.
Right.
It seems to me that would carry weight as if you were just a patient advocate, having come from a very conservative state, taking care of somebody who was not a relative. When I had a healthcare power of attorney, they listened to me
That's
as an
it.
advocate.
That's
Yes,
it.
very much so.
Yep.
Yeah.
And I
It's
think it
been my
works here too.
experience. Yeah.
Is there a professional that sort of thinks about this from a comprehensive perspective? So you all are all, right here is you all are coming at it from a medical perspective, but then there's also the will and the power of attorney
Yes.
perspective. And
There's
so
estate planning,
Yeah,
there's
so it
financial
seems like-
POA.
the
I-
person has to sort of reach out to different professionals to get different directives.
I'm a big fan of the Senior Citizens Law Organization here, which offers free assistance with most documents. They are, and so I've sent many people to them. I think they're a great nonprofit. I have just had a meeting with them recently, though, suggesting that they consider changing the language of the healthcare directive. And it is very possible to meet with them and designate your power of attorney and do everything, but pull out a page from one of these documents saying, this is the language I want to use about my wishes and values, so that you don't end up in that, I want to prolong life, I don't want to prolong life menu, for sure, because you can craft your own document. And a couple other folks I've worked on through the community have started using some of this language. But there is really, really, really a separation in understanding in the medical and the legal field about healthcare directives, which is completely different than the expertise I offer the legal community in every other facet of estate planning.
Could you repeat the resource? I didn't hear it. Citizen?
See, it's, I think I call it the Senior Citizens
Law
Law
Office.
Law Center, but it's Law Office.
Yeah.
I know it's an O.
Yeah.
And they're over on Zuni,
Mhm.
near Washington-ish area,
Yeah.
and they're a nonprofit that's been in the community forever.
They're
and they offer
excellent.
really, really useful assistance to people who are often struggling not just with power of attorney issues, but around registering for Medicaid and what you do if you're, for instance, in a couple and one person needs Medicaid for nursing home placement, and how do you protect the income and the house of the surviving spouse. Really, really useful work. Yeah.
Although, if you have, there's certain issues that there is a requirement for your income and stuff like
Yeah,
that.
yeah.
But they do refer you to other people if, in that case, if you don't qualify for their services. I know for if you're writing a regular will, they don't do that unless you qualify by income.
Well,
But
they
do
have
other
estate
people.
planning, but if you have enough money, they will move you over to
Over
someone
to-
you can
yeah.
pay for those services. but they'll
Some
do
of
it
the
for
other
lower
things I
income.
think are free for
Yeah,
anybody.
yeah, no,
They're
yeah.
very good.
Something I really liked about him is I have a sister who's not able to leave the house. And they were very wonderful to
Yeah.
come to the house and work with her right there.
Mm.
And they also have workshops at the different senior centers
Mhm.
Mhm.
that
Yeah,
my
they're
husband
great.
and I went to. We were with several other couples, and we did both our financial and our health power of attorneys right there. They even had a notary,
Good.
which I thought was really lovely.
Excellent.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Right. You had your hand up.
Yeah.
I have parents that live out of state. And so do they have a lot of these resources in other states, or is this pretty much the state of New Mexico?
They do. It's highly dependent on the state.
What state?
Wisconsin?
Oh,
They're good.
Gunderson
Yeah.
Lutheran is La
They're
Crosse,
good.
Wisconsin. Now, I'll warn you, there's a huge terrain in Wisconsin
Yes.
around these issues because it is also the center for the Catholic bishops group that worked very hard to try to overcome this form and speak out against it. So you have to navigate the territory county by county. But yeah, there are some wonderful resources there. The program that Gunderson Lutheran created is a program called Respecting Choices, and it's used by many health systems in that area.
And then my other question is with, who determines a person's ability to make a decision? If it's not medically driven, but, like my father refuses to go to the hospital because he has Alzheimer's. Does my sister, who is their power of attorney, get to make that decision and force him to go?
Did he declare himself before he lost decisional capacity? So yes, she does. So she's the one you're going to be negotiating with. And it isn't just negotiating with, it's really making sure that there's, and that's where I would search for palliative care support, because a lot of the conversations will be around what the disease looks like as it progresses and what choices are best for him. And that'll be really complex. It's not simple.
The Conversation Project has a starter resource kit for families, patients and families living with Alzheimer's and other forms of dementia, and how to, as best you can, continue to fold patients into the decision-making process, but also move forward with what has to happen.
Decisional capacity is a subtle art form, and basically the way that it works in our state, or the way that we handle decisional capacity, if you want to be very legalistic about it, is that a primary or an attending physician plus one other licensed member of a medical care team together need to determine that someone doesn't have decisional capacity. I think it's often less formal than that, frankly, and that's why I referred to people being ignored as they lost cognitive ability. Decisional capacity should be defined around the decision that is being made. So decisional capacity includes decisions about what you want to eat that day, right? If a person has insight and judgment around that, then they get to make that choice. So when I'm trying to evaluate someone's decisional capacity in terms of medical decision making, even if they do have some signs of cognitive decline, I'm trying to understand if they have insight and judgment into that condition, and if they understand the risks and benefits of treatments. And that can be a fairly unsophisticated understanding. So if someone can tell me the name of their condition, I have a bad heart, I have cancer, the doctor told me I should have surgery. If I don't have surgery, I might die. I'm worried about the surgery. We're having an insight judgment conversation, right? I mean, even though we haven't been able to express it more thoroughly than that. Those are the level, so someone has the right to have a medical decision making, even a right to make medical decisions even when they can't balance their checkbook. Those are different areas of capacity.
Right. Capacity can be intermittent and it can be partial. It can go away at 20 minutes of 6 on a Sunday evening, quite predictably, and come back Monday morning. And if you happen to know that a patient sunsets and that at this time of day it's just not so good, you can wait. That's the intermittent part. And the partial part, not good with finances, can't remember who the president is, and can understand what she does or doesn't want medically. So those are two very important differentiating factors.
In medical decision making, we will look for some consistency. So if every 3 hours the decision flips, you'll be doubting that you're dealing with someone who really has insight and judgment. Other than that, so sundowning can be a little complicated that way. But yes, I think it's incredibly accurate.
What is your determining factor for palliative care? We have a definition for hospice care when you enter into that kind of hospice treatment, 6 months terminal diagnosis. But palliative care is a little fuzzier, isn't it?
Yes, and it should be. The reason is that palliative care is meant to be a level of care offered by a team to give you support while you're dealing with serious illness. There's been nothing there about death, right? Serious illness, you need support getting through this. It is to deal with the pain, the symptoms, the suffering, the stresses that are part of serious illness. And it should occur concurrently with curative care, not just after curative care. And I prefer when it's offered at a time of diagnosis. So we tend to link in our minds cancer and palliative care. There's many other forms of disease I can talk about, but I believe that people who are diagnosed with an advanced cancer ought to receive a palliative care consult as part of the initial intervention, right? We send them to dietitians, we send them to therapists, we send them to palliative care can definitely be part of that and can offer support through the treatment that will follow, as well as good medical advice around prognosis and the condition and treating symptoms. So in addition, people who are diagnosed with dementia should at least have an initial consultation with a palliative care specialist. And that's actually a time where if we can tease out that they do have capacity, we're going to home in on that advance directive really quickly. One of the things that can happen as you have end-stage Alzheimer's is you lose the ability to swallow. And you can choke from that. We call that aspiration. It is just heartrending to find a recommendation in the chart for someone to receive a feeding tube for aspiration pneumonia from Alzheimer's, partly because it doesn't even work technically. Feeding tubes do not keep you from aspirating, but it's also never been shown that a feeding tube in a person with advanced directive improves their life or even extends their life. In fact, it might even be a life-shortening intervention. So, but if I can capture someone who I know has a progressive neurological or progressive dementia, and we can talk about it ahead of time, and we can get a document set up that says, I do not want artificial nutrition, then they've declared themselves really clearly, and it will give much relief to family members later who have a document and don't feel like they're the ones trying to make a choice about decisions, treatment options that feel punitive. I talk to so many people who say, well, I don't want him to starve. And that's not what's really happening. He's having a natural change in his appetite, and that's appropriate. And choking hurts, and no one wants to do it. So it's a relief of suffering, but it's hard unless there's documentation. So people who are diagnosed with congestive heart failure, a disease that can last for many, many years, it's nice when you're in the moderate or severe stages of that you meet with a palliative care physician, and that we take on, or a palliative care nurse practitioner, a palliative care PA, social workers do palliative care. There are volunteers and chaplains involved in palliative care efforts, as well as nurses. It's a team. But meet with people and start having conversations about chocolate ice cream.
And that's in addition to the primary care?
Some primary care physicians do excellent palliative care. And if you have a deep, meaningful relationship with a primary care physician who can speak to you about your wishes and document them and honor them, great. You don't need to head out to a tertiary specialist. But you may want that specialist if you're dealing with symptoms that are hard to manage. But in this day and age, it's hard for primary care physicians to have the time necessary to have those conversations. Really is. They want to do it, but they don't have the time.
And you all know now that Medicare will pay for a discussion with your physician around your end-of-life treatment wishes.
It's called advanced care planning.
And they get paid.
They pay for palliative.
Completely. Yeah, and most medical insurance plans pay for palliative care.
And
It's a medical specialty like cardiology, like pulmonology, like it's actually a fellowship-trained medical specialty.
And so do all hospitals here in Albuquerque have a palliative care team?
I have heard rumors that Loveless has got one. I'm not sure the depth of it at this point. I know they were working towards
UNMH does.
UNM does, and
Pres.
Presbyterian does. And then in the regionals, we've got a palliative care team in Espanola. We're hoping to expand to others. We're trying to create a palliative care team for the new Santa Fe hospital, too.
What about South and Cruces Memorial Mountain?
So those are both, I've heard that they have just started a palliative care, some degree of palliative care services in Las Cruces at one of the two hospitals, but it hasn't been available up till now.
It's always worth asking if you, family member, friend, or in the hospital, things are really difficult. I just tell folks,
Use the
ask
word.
for it.
And
Use
the
it.
reaction you may get maybe, but you're not dying yet.
That's
So that's
right.
fine. I know I'm not dying yet. I still
No.
want to talk to the palliative care team.
That's right. You don't
Because
have to be
it's,
dying.
because it is sort of this knee-jerk sort of, but we're still treating you. It's like, yes, I still would like to have a conversation about values, about goals,
And about feeling better.
and about feeling better.
Yeah,
and
really.
maybe getting some symptoms treated so I can feel better.
Well, in Arizona, it's attached to hospice.
Depends on the
So-
town and the institution.
When the man I was caring for found that out, he wouldn't go.
Yeah, it's variable. Here we do not fund, hospice and palliative care are in the same department, but they're not co-managed in the same way. So our palliative care services are available. We actually send specialists into the home. We have palliative care clinics and primary care settings at Presbyterian as well as in the cancer center. And then we have inpatient palliative care teams. So we try to spread it through the community.
But historically, the two are linked. And
it
in
depends.
people's memory.
It's got to do with the funding base. So, for instance, our palliative home team is a home health care team with palliative skills. It's not linked to the hospice. Many hospices built palliative care teams because they wanted to care for people who were not either yet qualifying for hospice, or because there were people who were refusing to sign hospice consents and receive that care. So literally, community by community, palliative will be linked differently. Yeah, but yeah, the H word, as I say. Sometimes I'll say to people, I'm sorry, but I'm going to use the H word.
So 2 aphorisms for you, aphorisms, however it is. It's always too soon until it's too late. And it's not about what's the matter with you, it's about what matters to you. So those are little take-homes.
This sounds like a good time to make closing statements.
I think we did, right there, yeah.
Yeah.
Lots of documents there, how to get in touch with us, available. And you're
And
for-
I'm happy to give people, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt
No, I was just
you,
gonna say,
John.
you're lucky to be in New Mexico. I mean, this is one area where we are, what?
I'm in Montana.
You're in Montana. Beautiful sky.
Good place to live, not a good place to die.
Yeah. Well, except there was Ira Byock.
Did you guys make any adjustments or any concerns about the situations that came out in the paper about, you know, the people who were stuck in the nursing home and had all the abuses going on?
Do you mean that couple?
Yeah, and then maybe the system itself. Did that raise any?
So actually, the big adjustment so there was a famous case several years ago about a couple who were in an assisted living, not a nursing home, who very much had decided not to pursue further medical care, and the assisted living just had a terrifically difficult time with their decision, and it was a big set of stories in the paper. And that was actually before this document had been created, and that story was part of what we used to compel the development of the document in the community. And at this point, our advanced care planning program manager has actually worked with every nursing home in the community to use and honor this document. And it's right there on the top of the chart with the DNR form for specifically the reason of wanting to be able to honor people's wishes for their care, right? And so we've also worked to train the first responders, who are like ambulance folks, EMTs, paramedics, to actually look for this document and honor it too, because our goal was to make sure that people's wishes were honored across hospital, nursing home, assisted living, in their home, across care settings, which is where this document is really valuable.
But it really helps to have a live advocate making sure
Yeah,
that people know
absolutely.
that this matters, that we're watching.
And if you do go into a retirement home or any place, I would say that should be one of the questions you ask.
Yes.
Is, do you honor this? Will you call 911 even if I don't want you to? If you know, will you allow hospice workers to come in? You know, because I think they're getting a lot better.
Yeah.
But it doesn't hurt
coming from
to
us.
have that as one of the questions right after. And how much do I have to pay? Will you honor this? You know, I think it's up to all of us before we die to ask all of the questions we can, so we have all the information and not assume that everybody is going to be as forthcoming as certain hospitals and certain facilities and certain groups. You know, it's up to us to take the responsibility to find out about some of these things.
Good.
Excellent conversation. Thank you so much.
Thank you,
Joyce.
Gail. Thank you.